Marie and I were thinking about how we could be helpful in providing information to you all. And one of the things that we want to do is make sure that this is a very valuable time. Like time is the only resource that we really want to focus on. And so what we're going to talk about today is really covering a brief overview of the industry, not going too deep, but some core markets, some of the core ways of outsourcing. From there, we're also going to look at how businesses look at outsourcing from a strategic point of view, pros and cons of different outsourcing partners and different ways to select partners and different values that we see a lot of companies look for, and then how to build a successful relationship, and specifically a BPO relationship. So those are the areas. There's about 10 minutes each of content. So hopefully, we can get about 20 minutes of Q&A. I'm really excited to jump in. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with a quick intro on me and the company, and then I'm going to pass it over to Marie to introduce herself as well. So I founded Boldr. I've been in this industry since I graduated university. Really excited and a huge believer in the idea of building global teams. I spent 6 years living in the Philippines from 2013 to 2019, one with building Boldr, but then also launching a previous company, a former venture. And I'm a huge believer in this industry, but also the potential for impact that we could have, not only with the companies that we're building global teams with, but with the team members in the communities that we're working with. And with that, we launched Boldr. We're the largest B Corp certified outsourcing company in the world. The way I like to describe what we do is we're here to create opportunity for global talent by connecting talent to great companies. My proudest accomplishment at Boldr has been the work we've done around championing living wage and really partnering with NGOs, nonprofits, and think tanks to define living wage benchmarks in our core markets. So that's a little bit about me. Marie, I'd love to hear from you if you're willing to introduce yourself as well.
So I'm Marie Parker. I know my name's pronounced a little bit funny. My mom forgot to put the E at the end. I grew up in South Africa. I've lived in a few different countries, like 4 different countries. Spent most of my 20s in Europe, actually, in the UK and in Belgium. And I've traveled quite a bit around the world while I spent like 14 years of my career in the logistics industry and like international freight forwarding. But a lot of what I did there was actually setting up like a centralized service centers for a very large company in the US and in Ireland and Philippines and in China. So deeply familiar with, or had some like early exposure to the type of work that we do in the markets in which we operate. I have a very deep personal connection with the markets we operate in, and I'm pretty passionate about the impact that we get to make on these communities, having grown up in that environment. And while I grew up on the privileged side of a broken system, it's been really heartwarming to be in a position to give back to those communities and make a difference there. I really enjoy helping our clients solve some complex business problems or figuring out how to scale. And then I think a big part of my identity that I'd remiss not to mention to anybody I meet is that I am a mom of 2 little boys. They are 5 and 10 years old, and we are very excited for the holidays coming up.
One quick thing, this conversation is going to be really oriented towards CX outsourcing, so not necessarily IT outsourcing or engineering or DevShops or anything like that. Really wanted to focus on providing this overview of the CX landscape. And one of the things here is, you could see that India still remains like the largest employer when it comes to global outsourced talent. But one of the things, though, is that the Philippines is incredibly, and it is now known more globally as like being the CX dominant player. And one of the things that we've really been excited about is the emerging markets that have popped up in Latin America. What's visualized here is Brazil, but all over around Colombia and Costa Rica, Honduras, really exciting markets. And also, I'd be remiss if I say Mexico, which is where I am today in our office there. In Africa, South Africa is probably the dominant outsourcing market. There's other markets like Kenya and Egypt who are emerging as well. But South Africa has the most infrastructure and also the most growing demand there. It's really servicing the European market. So just looking at that, the next slide here that I wanted to kind of just focus on is outsourcing has a really negative connotation, and I can get into a little bit more of that, as to why on the next slide. But initially, and one of the things that I'm really excited about, and one of the things that Boldr and like many emerging BPOs are trying to shift from, is really shifting the narrative from purely cost savings to value creation. Um, and this is just resident of like the industry that we've inherited from the 1980s and 1990s, where everyone was just really focused on reducing costs as quickly as possible. And so when you do that, there's an opportunity for challenges to arise. And so there is a known dark side to the industry. There are, obviously news. You could read that quite quickly. You can hear about it in the news. You could also talk to people who've had negative experiences. And it's my belief that anytime you have an industry that's built on cost savings, primarily, there's unintended consequences that can emerge from that. The easiest way that we like to describe this is that two parties typically benefit in an outsourcing relationship. One is the company providing the outsourcing services, so the BPO in this case, and the second party would be the company that's choosing to outsource. Typically, team members and the community are left a little bit unattended. And what this leads to is some of the norms that we have in our industry, which is north of 50% attrition. And what that leads to is, high turnover leads to an impact on the quality of the experience for our customer base, which could then lead to, if a customer has a poor experience, then it degrades trust. So this industry, as I like to think about it, has a trust issue. And so we're really working on that. And there's a lot of great companies out there that are working on that, which I can show in the next slide, in the coming slide. Before getting to that, one of the things that I thought would be helpful is just some nomenclature, and just some getting the names correct. And there's so many different ways to outsource. And typically when we talk to companies, they're like, hey, I want to outsource. And the questions that come up is like, okay, well, how do you want to do that? And some of the companies are deeply curious about setting up their own infrastructure, in creating their own subsidiary in some of these global markets. Some of them are really interested in partnering with a BPO. Some people don't necessarily know what a BPO is. Other groups, and one of the things that I'm the most passionate about right now is this concept of employer of record. So the idea of working with a group that will literally have the individuals on their HR employment documents, et cetera, set up their payroll, but you don't necessarily have to manage that compliance piece. And so the EOR industry has really been something that's really been hot ever since COVID. There's companies like Deal, Papaya, remote.com who have really just exploded. And then there's the freelancer economy and the freelancer market, which is an incredible way to tap into global talent as well, and really became popular, after the 4-hour work week with Tim Ferriss. Some of the ways that I like to think about the differences here: companies who choose to work with an employer of record and get access to global talent, they are fundamentally responsible for the KPIs and delivery of those team members. They're responsible for the severance liability and all of the employment costs that'll come in there, whereas a BPO really manages that for you, and in essence is responsible for the KPIs and the delivery of that team. So when you partner with a BPO, you don't necessarily have that compliance risk. You don't necessarily have that financial risk around severance, et cetera, or any HR related risks there. But on the EOR side, you would. Great. And if there's any questions, or if you want to chime in and ask anything at any time, please don't hesitate to jump in. Before going to the next section, I just wanted to quickly cover just way that we look at the market. So there's very large BPOs that have been around, since the 80s and 90s, and there's a lot of consolidation happening in the space. And then there's these really emerging companies, one of which is Boldr, but then there's plenty of others who are really positioning themselves for what is kind of known in our industry as BPO 2.0, the ability to work with companies to add additional value beyond just, offshoring this process or team into a new market.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the business strategy around outsourcing, and by what I mean by that is just some factors for you to consider, like what are like pros and cons or advantages of outsourcing, or some of the pitfalls that we've seen. And I think it's important to color our perspective here from where we're coming, right? So we're an outsourcing partner, so we've had clients try to work with us and it hasn't worked, and that's the advice that I'm going to give you, or the insights that I'm going to give you here. There might be some broader perspective. And I trust that each of you, if you've had an experience with outsourcing, that you can actually add quite a bit in here. So to start off with, like key factors to consider before you outsource a process, To me, it really starts with like a maturity element that is really important here. And it's the maturity of your processes, your product, and your team is important to consider. Like a well-documented process is ideal for outsourcing, as well as like a realistic understanding of your product or your service. Um, Knowing what good looks like is really helpful. Being able to define measurable success criteria and KPIs is really helpful for setting up an outsourcing process for success, or setting up that partnership for success. When you have like a solid and healthy, so when specifically talking about customer support, when you have a solid or healthy relationship between your support team and your product team, you are much more likely to set up a successful outsourcing relationship. We've definitely seen cases where a client says, hey, we want you to do our customer support. They have some pretty big like product challenges, and the relationship between the customer support like executive and the product team is not like healthy. And what happens then is they just choose a metric, let's say CSAT, and they're obsessed about CSAT, and they're like, you guys have to, and it's all your fault, and they put it all on the outsourcing partner. Meanwhile, like there's no way for their consumers to be happy, because it's not all about the tone and voice and how I'm interacting with you. There's some like real product issues that are not given the light of day, or it's not, the person doesn't have the right seat at the right table to have the right conversations to make a shift there. And that can be a tricky situation in which to engage with a partner if you don't have realistic expectations of them, and if your internal relationships aren't healthy there. The maturity of your support team is actually really helpful as well. Like for example, like if your support team is mature enough to understand how to divide workflows between your internal team and your outsourced team, that is really helpful, and that's a good indicator that you're ready to partner with somebody. If you're just setting up your support team for the first time, there are partners that can actually help you out with that. And we do have a couple of clients where we are their entire support organization. So it's impossible to do that. It's just harder to do that. I have seen much more success and scalability when a client comes to us with a more mature support team. And they're like, I now understand that these processes, I don't need my stateside team to handle. I can divide and conquer, and I know how to divide these workflows up in a productive way. And I think that there's very similar questions that you can ask in an outsourcing use case than you would about automation. It's, what is a repetitive task that the team is getting bored of doing? What are like tasks or workflows that are keeping your internal team from doing higher value and more engaging work? And those are things that, and I would always encourage a client to ask both those questions: is, can this be automated? And if it can't yet, then outsourcing is a great solution, indefinitely or interim as well. It's also a great opportunity when you have something that is ripe for automation, but there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done with that. What I've seen companies do very successfully is to engage with an outsourcing partner to kind of handle the day-to-day work function while they're doing the more complex work of figuring out how to automate the thing. And you can do those workflows in parallel, and then over time, you either downscale the outsource partnership, or you shift the work that they do to higher value work, because now they understand the manual stuff well enough. You often have an opportunity to upskill them. And the beauty in that is then you also have an opportunity to create a career for some of these individuals, which is pretty neat. I think another factor to consider here is to be realistic about the time that it takes to find a partner and to set the partnership up for success. Recruitment and training is just the starting point. Depending on the complexity of your process and the technical nature of it, there's often a learning curve that needs to be considered before you can get to a point where the outsourced team is performing against your KPIs. So while you have a mature process, you know your KPIs, you know what success looks like, I think it is very important to also be realistic about how long it will take to get the team members hired, trained, and comfortable enough with your processes so they're actually performing against those KPIs. Those are kind of the main key success factors that I would consider. If we go into the next slide here, when is outsourcing not ideal for you? It's kind of the counter to a lot of what I've said there. It's if you have a constantly evolving process, it's super complex and it's going to be tough for you to keep up with training. It's one or two things are going to happen. Like either it's just not going to work if you have a very complex process or a constantly evolving process, or you need to be intentional about investing in the training. Or there is another option to consider, is you may need to invest in more experienced team members at a higher investment in that case. Like you just got to be realistic. You can't have entry-level positions handling a ever-evolving, or individuals that their experience is more in line with repetitive, well-defined processes. And if you have a constant evolving process, that's going to be a mismatch, and it gets pretty messy. If you are in early stages of product development, I think it's really, really important. And we've had a few inbounds where we've actually told clients, hey, I don't think you're ready for this. When you're at early stages of your product development and trying to get that market fit, it's really important to stay close to the voice of the customer. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about that relationship between product and your consumer, your end consumer, right? So keeping that tight in the beginning is really important. And I would not recommend that you outsource at that point of the business or the product development process. Then there's two other use cases that come to mind for me. There's regulatory limitations. Some industries do not allow operations outside of the United States. It's just being cognizant of that. We've had inbounds as well ask us about it, and we domestic outsourcing is a viable option. It's just not one that I think David and I can speak to, with much information here today. So we're really focused on outsourcing outside of the United States. And then there's another weird one we've seen, which is when you land a deal with a big company. The example that comes to mind was it was a SaaS product, and they started doing business with, I think it was Amazon or Ford or one of these major corporations, which insisted that they have 24/7 coverage, but their product is super technical. So the challenge you have is you have to build this team that has 24/7 coverage, but they don't have frequent interaction with your product or with these workflows, and your product or workflow is really complex. It's a very challenging situation for an outsourcing partner to set up for success. So those are kind of the top of mind for me of when outsourcing is not ideal for you. And I think if there's anything else that you guys have experienced personally, please feel free to drop them in the chat here to help out the community. And if we move into the advantages of outsourcing, I think there's the very obvious cost savings. It definitely is a much more scalable way and sustainable way to grow a team, especially if you are in a moment where your support team is growing linearly to the growth of your business. That definitely becomes quickly unsustainable in the US, and it makes a lot of sense to go to a lower cost market for that. You can also gain significant efficiencies. We've had, when we've done data entry work, especially, if you have a team hyper-focused on that, the efficiency and quality gains that you can get from that is pretty phenomenal, because we typically see that it's part of somebody's job within the organization, but if it's somebody's whole job at Boldr or at the outsource partner, you get some pretty cool efficiencies and quality out of that. Working with partners that have specialized expertise and can share industry-specific best practices. So I think this is why we picked customer support as our kind of main topic here today, is exactly that. We have a bunch of clients that we do customer support for. And so if you coming to us as an e-commerce business, we can give you advice based on what we've seen across the industry as well. And I think that can be really helpful, just getting those insights and actually building those connections as well. We typically help our clients build community within these spaces and finding other support leaders within a similar industry that you can share knowledge with as well. And yeah, just partnering with somebody who's been there, who's seen what you're going through before and can guide you through it is pretty amazing. And again, it allows your internal team to focus on automation and driving further process improvements while your outsourcing team does all the work. I spoke about that before. You can hire really talented individuals who are actually really excited about doing this work. And I think there's something magical that happens when you have somebody doing a task that might feel like torture to one person, but if they're coming in and they're actually excited about doing this, It has a great impact on your brand in terms of the interactions that people are having. And it feels good to just make that investment in those individuals. And this is my little plug, just because of where I sit and where I'm coming from, is if you do it right, you can feel really good about the impact that you get to have on the communities that you're investing in as well. So there's a lot of like really straightforward business like benefits to this, and there's some emotional stuff to it as well that I'd be remiss not to mention. Yeah, so moving on to disadvantages and pitfalls, this is definitely a challenge depending on the market you're in, the partner you're with, and the process that they use to screen and vet for language capabilities. That can be a real challenge. And attrition, absolutely. I would always recommend that and we will speak to that a little bit when we talk about how to pick a partner. And I think it's important to actually look at those as well. It's such a big investment for you when you have to retrain. And having a partner that can ensure or has a track record of lower attrition and just happier team members and employees makes the world of difference for you in terms of your investment, because you then can train the trainer basically and set this thing up to kind of run itself over time. I would never advocate for you to completely disengage. There's a lot of value in treating these team members as an extension of your team, but lower attrition just allows you to take a different perspective on that for sure. Other disadvantages that come to mind as well is it goes back to that early product thing, like you're one step removed from your customer. So if you're not ready, if you don't have the systems and processes and tools to maintain or the partner actually, quite frankly, to give you the insights that you need to really use those customer insights to improve your product, this does remove you one step from your customer. And for me, I think about my interaction as a consumer and how frustrated I feel when I'm talking to somebody and I'm like, I know that you are not the business that's selling me this product, this individual I'm talking to, and I literally have to tell them, you tell your supervisor to tell your client to go and fix the thing. And so that it's a thing, right? The other thing that comes to mind for me is you may get exposed to some other labor regulations. So I don't know if it's as much a disadvantage as it's just something to, again, be realistic about here. Is these other labor markets do not have employment at will as we have in the United States. And so while, like David mentioned before, a good BPO partner is going to protect you from those regulations because they're obviously the employer, you are still, quote unquote, exposed to it. And as much as you need to understand why the contract with your outsourcing partner is going to have certain clauses in it, like I need 30 days or 60 days notice if you're going to ramp somebody down because I have a severance liability that I can't completely absorb. I need to figure out what I'm going to do with these team members. It's an example of, it can cause a little bit of frustration just because it's the labor regulations influence some of the behavior in that partnership that might just feel unfamiliar because it's not employment at will as we have in the United States. Trying to think if there's anything else there to add. Cultural barriers, I think it's something to be aware of, and I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later. If we move on to pitfalls here, there can be challenges in knowledge transfer, particularly in technical domains. There's a risk of a misalignment in job titles. So if you say hey, I have tier one support team members that I want to hire, and if you just go off of that nomenclature with a partner and ask them to hire, I think it's super, super important to be crystal clear, to actually share the job description, go through what you mean with the job description, make sure that they ask intelligent questions of you, and that they go further than just the JD, and they go for they have a conversation with you to understand the competencies, experience, and skill sets that are required so that they can translate your requirements into the local nomenclature to post a job ad that's going to get you the talent that you need.
Yeah, we see that a lot with support engineers specifically, because support engineers can mean many different things for different organizations. So typically, we're happy to, and most companies will share their standard or templated support engineering job description, but they'll also ask you as the client, how do you define this? What are the programming languages, the years of experience that you need here? So that is just something that comes up quite often. Sorry, Maria, I just wanted to address that.
Absolutely. And then have some patience in that recruiting process, because what then often happens is like you talk to a few people you talk to a few candidates, or you start working with a candidate that's been hired and you're like, this isn't quite what I need. And sometimes that refinement process can take longer than expected. And if you're looking for a unicorn, to have the patience to hunt for one is very helpful. Then there's the complexities of managing global teams, including the cultural and communication barriers. I think that was brought up before as well. So finding partners that know how to navigate that and hold your hand through that and give you some advice and ideas on how to work across multiple cultures and languages. The necessity of continuous investment in time and energy in your outsourcing relationship. Like, it's not a set it and forget it thing. Executive sponsors who invest time and energy in the relationship can make a real difference. It's important to have like an internal advocate and have those relationships solid. And I think for me, one of the big pitfalls that I've seen is when a client assumes that because these individuals are on the other side of an SLA and they're on the other side of the ocean, that they're all of a sudden they're not human beings anymore. And you're like, hey, they're kind of still people. And that doesn't mean you just get to, like a switch, or just turn things on and off quite as rapidly as you might want to, right? So there's some considerations. And I think the pitfall is when you don't look at these individuals as an extension of your own team, it can cause a lot of friction in the relationship with your partner. And if it doesn't cause friction in the relationship with a partner, it might just mean that they have high turnover because of how they're treating their team members. And it might be difficult for them to hire if they don't have a good brand awareness.
Assuming you're going the route of a BPO, instead of setting up your own infrastructure or partnering with a team of freelancers, or leveraging an EOR to hire direct, there's some really clear differentiators that we think are quite important. And every company is different. And so you have the opportunity to really choose based on your own value systems and your own culture at your company. And the beautiful thing about a quite saturated industry, there's thousands of BPOs all around, is that you get to get really clear on what's important to you and then go find that in a partner. So, and I'll just go through a list of these, and if it's helpful, we can share these later. But geography is a big one. Language came up. Culture also is huge, and to consider is, do you want to have a more affluent a group of culture that has an understanding of the U.S. market and how that works? If so, you would want to consider markets that are closer to the U.S., potentially the Philippines, because of their natural relationship with the U.S., which is a really awesome thing to discuss. But the other piece there is that does the BPO partner have only one sole country in their operation? Are they doubling down on the Philippines, and that's all they are there? Because then you open up a BCP risk if there's a tornado or a volcano eruption or a typhoon or et cetera, you name it. The other piece is maturation. There's the huge publicly traded large enterprise BPOs, and then there's smaller players like us, and then there's even smaller players than us who are operating at a very small scale. And the way that I like to think about this is like, how big of a fish do you want to be in their pool when you're working with them? And it's not necessarily. Yeah, I'm not going to put my own perception or perspective on that, but that's a question that comes up a lot. A point of view that we're really passionate about, and that I think is something that you want to consider, is do BPOs share information on employee health, employee net promoter score, retention? Are those statistics that they're proactively sharing with you, or is that something that's coming up in the sales process? If they're not sharing that information with you, there's there might be some signal there as some concerns. The only other thing I would say about retention is that it's measured differently by company. So just asking how they actually come up with this retention statistic is important, not just receiving the percent. The other piece, is this BPO operating in partnership with the communities? Do they have relationships with universities that they can, for funneling top talent? How are they attracting that talent in those markets is something that a lot of companies also tend to ask us. And then additionally, like, how are they developing their team members? Does the BPO actively have a learning and development department? Are they investing into their team members? Do they have a budget allocation for that? Other questions around values come up quite often. One of the things that we like to do and other BPOs do as well is we like to hire based on the values that not only we have, but then our client has. So we'll look at your values, your core values of the company, and proactively hire and screen there. Which kind of leads me to my next differentiator or thing to consider with, are you hiring off of the BPO's bench? Like, do they have a pool of resources already? Or do you want them to go to market and identify the talent based on your job description and your values that you have? Just a thing to consider there. And then, this one might be a little obvious, but it's important to ask is, have they solved this problem that you're asking them to do? Have they done this work before, and what use cases and what information can they share with you that can demonstrate their success in it already? And then the last one, especially in a post-COVID world, is, do they still have physical infrastructure? Are they, what is their strategy when it comes to remote, hybrid, or in office? And how does it align to what you have at the company? One of the other pieces that I think would be helpful is just how pricing is typically structured. This might be common knowledge for everybody, so I'll keep it quick. And if there's things we want to double click on, let me know. The way I like to think about BPOs is that for company, there's three different services that I can think about when it comes to CX outsourcing. One is just flexible staffing. So companies will come to a BPO and say, hey, I just need you to handle 9 to 5, 24 to 7. I don't need dedicated teams. I have a very small volume of work and I just need you to handle it. And that's typically like a flex service offering, which exists in the market. And there's pros and cons to that, obviously, but we can get into that as well. The other one is where you're paying per dedicated team member. This is typically in relationships that are north of like a team of 5 or 20. And in that domain, what a BPO will typically say is, hey, we need to charge you a flat rate per person per month. And what they're doing there is, And then typically management costs will be additional on that. So yes, if you say, hey, I need 10 customer support team members, they'll say, okay, you need 10 customer support team members, a shift lead, and potentially an operations manager or a team captain, which is an additional charge. There are some BPOs that actually bundle that into a flat rate per team member, which we could get into as well. But then what you'll start seeing in the market, and especially as you move to having a larger and larger operation, I would say typically about when you start moving north of 30 team members, you'll see companies asking and putting pressure on the BPO to say, hey, I just want to pay an hourly rate for the support volume that you're handling. And typically that's when you can trade economics for that scale. And a BPO would say, okay, we can do that, and we'll have a blended hourly rate that we'll use here.
It begins with these are some of the tips and tricks of what we've seen in terms of setting up a successful partnership. Is we like to call it like crawl, walk, run, and our project plans or implementation plans indicate this as well. Just begin with the simple tasks and then gradually increase the complexity. Don't try to get these team members who are not, sitting next to you in your organization to take on the most complex things to start with. Build trust and learn how to work together. And I think that's part of that solid foundation, and part of taking it like step by step is a way to build trust and just understand how can you work together. I think it's super important to know that you are in partnership with somebody. If I think about the most successful relationship that we've had and the businesses that we've worked with for 5+ years and have grown significantly with, it's not that we've never made mistakes, but it's all about what happens how do we react when there is a mistake? And are we able to have a frank conversation and do the right things, be open about what happened, why happened, own our stuff, and course correct from there. And if you are able to navigate some challenges with the individuals and with the company in partnership, you can build some cool stuff together. It's important to have a solid foundation, emphasizing early leadership recruitment, establishing robust operational processes. So I think there's David talked a little bit about management ratios. So if you're outsourcing in that dedicated team member model, which I think that's kind of the bulk of the work that we do is with companies that have this dedicated team model. prioritizing the hiring of the leadership is super helpful, because then you're putting yourself in a position to train the trainer. And if you get that team captain or a client experience manager or operations manager, whatever the terminology that the outsourcing partner is using, but if you get the leader set up for success and really understanding your processes and feeling like they're your right hand, it sets everything else up for greater success, because they'll know how to hire, they'll know how to train, and you get, some significant scalability, a lot of mileage out of that. And then I think it's really important to have an internal champion, like designate a team member within the organization to spearhead the outsourcing initiative and ensure a smooth integration. And it's important to have somebody that knows how to navigate your organization and has like some strong, I want to say project management skills, but it's also like influencing, like, right? And somebody who knows, especially when there's cross-departmental stuff that happens, the person that is owning that relationship in your organization needs to have the right exposure and leverage internally to be able to set it up for success.
Yeah, and capacity like that. Like, is this an OKR that they have? Are they, do they have the capacity freed up to work on this? Because it is a big lift. So I just don't want that to go understated. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think that similar to the crawl, walk, run, like if you are able to set up a team in one location to start and then expand into other geographies over time, that gets you that same rhythm, right? It's all about the amount you invest in the front end is the value is very much related to the value you're going to get over time in an outsourcing relationship. So don't be shy to invest a lot in the front end in terms of taking your time to find the right people, making sure that they're trained well, there's a strong foundation, the partnership is solid, and then the growing with that partner then becomes super easy. And we've seen some phenomenal growth with clients where they were willing to make that investment in the beginning of our relationship. And I think that there's a lot of things that we've already mentioned in this conversation that would also lead to these, successful partnership with the BPO. So there's a lot of that stuff, like knowing what success looks like. What are your success factors? What are KPIs that really matter and that are truly indicative of success of the entire process? Like just defaulting to an average handling time, a resolution time, and a CSAT, because those are the most common ones. If you do that without really understanding your product, it can create a lot of friction. So I think that's super important. Thank you. And I think then come visit your team. This is something, it's so simple and it's totally overlooked. And especially with COVID, like there's people just got so used to being remote that we think that we don't need to do it. And the impact that I have seen on the individuals and on the success of our relationships with the clients who've made this investment is phenomenal. And it goes back to like feeling good about what you're doing as well, right? Is for just somebody in your organization getting the opportunity to travel to the Philippines or to South Africa or to Mexico. It's an investment in them as an individual and their personal development, plus the experience, plus the business value. Like there's all these layers to it. So I can't advocate for this enough, is to like plan for the T&E expense and make space for an in-person connection like once a year.
At least
it doesn't have to be super intense, but if you, and I'm going to like go back again about that upfront investment and how that pays off. If you do this in the beginning, and Caraway did that. And I think it was really neat how they approached this. Is Caraway went to South Africa to train their team, like right in the beginning. And they've been back a couple of times. And it's been an incredible experience.
And I just think of like the trust equation here. And if you're trying to create a level of empathy and where people will actually be very excited and intimacy is there, the easiest way to do that we know is just visiting in person. And what that allows for is just deeper conversations around what's working, what's not working, and really having that bedrock of trust. I think as soon as a company has north of 50 team members, there's established processes, departments, and divisions that things become a little bit easier to start identifying. ARR, we struggle with that just because there are companies that are smaller in nature who have a little bit more funding where they can make this investment going forward. Customer base, the support volume really needs to be there. The way that I look at it. So, the worst thing that can happen is you invest in this prematurely and there's not enough volume of support and you have to wind down the team. that has happened just with companies who invested immediately upon, just launching their product. So if there's a support volume that you could really segment out because you've already done your tiering for tier 1 and tier 2, and you know what you want to start with, that could be great. I also think, if we're speaking in generalities, like making sure that there's a point of contact who's really excited, your internal champion, that believes in it as well, because they'll be able to start identifying other processes and work streams that should move overseas and be the champion to make that happen.